Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's show. Today, I'm doing an interview with Professor Neil Manson, Professor of Philosophy and Religion. Do you want to briefly introduce, where you work and what you kind of work on?
Sure. I'm at the University of Mississippi, which is in Oxford, Mississippi. I kind of had a laugh. I know it's not right over this summer when I saw that our temperature was lower than that of yours there in the UK for much of the summer. That amused me a lot. I'm a specialist in the philosophy of religion. I got my PhD at Syracuse University with Peter Van Inwagen, and I wrote a dissertation on the fine-tuning argument. I've written a lot on the fine-tuning argument and on design arguments. I edited the anthology God and Design, the teleological argument in modern science. It's coming up on being 20 years old now. It's got a lot of really great papers in there, including ones not on this argument we're going to talk about, the fine-tuning argument, but on other versions of the design argument, biological versions of the design argument. That'll should be enough to get. Oh, I want to plug my textbook as well. This is Philosophy of Religion that just came out recently. So if you want to get a crash course in philosophy of religion, take a look at that book.
Awesome. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about the fine-tuning argument. And so I was just saying before we went live that there's broadly kind of two sections of questions. So the first section is going to be about sort of independently of the fine-tuning argument as it exists in philosophy of religion, what it means for things to be fine-tuned or fine-tuned for life. And then the second set of questions are going to be about, how the argument kind of bears on natural theology and relates to the questions of God's existence. So the first question then is, what does it mean for something to be fine-tuned?
Well, in the context of this argument, fine-tuning is applied to the free parameters of physics. And if your audience doesn't know this stuff, I'll do the best I can with it. So the universe as a whole let me back up a little bit. Before Big Bang cosmology was developed 100 years ago, there really wasn't a great theory about the universe as a whole. A lot of people thought it was eternal, and there didn't seem to be much specific to say about it. But subsequent to the development of Big Bang cosmology, it turns out that the universe can be described very precisely. So, for example, there's a precise age of the universe. I believe it's 12.75 billion years, plus or minus a couple hundred billion years. They've really narrowed that down. There's an overall rate of expansion of the universe. So you can really talk about the universe as a whole as being a concrete entity with well-defined properties. Furthermore, the laws of physics that govern what happens in this universe also have what are called free parameters. These are numbers that aren't derived from any other parameters in the system. So, for example, and don't quote me on this actually being a free parameter, but the speed of light is, for example, 2.99 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. And there might be no explanation for why it's exactly that number. It might, for all we know, have been 4.27 times 10 to the 8th, right? So that's a very specific number that science finds out. Well, it turns out, or at least it was noticed starting over 50 years ago, that a lot of these numbers had a very special quality to them, namely that if they had been just a little bit different, leaving all the other free parameters the same, then it would have knock-on effects such that life would not be possible in the universe. And that seems like a really strong claim. What do you mean life wouldn't be possible in the universe? Well, I'll give you an example. To me, this is one of the best examples. All the stuff in our bodies and in the body of any organism, right? It's made out of chemical elements, right? And these chemical elements are not just hydrogen and helium. They're things like carbon and oxygen and iron and so forth. All of those elements were formed early in the history of the universe in the interiors of stars through a process called nucleosynthesis, right? So the primordial universe, originally there was just hydrogen and helium. But through this fusion that happens within stars, you get the heavier elements formed. And it turns out if parameters such as the strength of the nuclear strong force or the strength of the nuclear weak force, these are the four fundamental forces in subatomic physics, right? If those had been just a little bit different, then nucleosynthesis wouldn't have happened, and there wouldn't be the heavy elements that seem to be necessary for there to be any sort of complex life at all. I mean, you could have had a universe that had stars in it, but it doesn't seem like you could have any kind of really anything complex if all there is in the universe is hydrogen and helium. Other examples concern the expansion rate of the universe. People have described that as being right on the knife's edge. If it had been much greater, all the matter would be too dispersed for the force of gravitation to have stars form and have this process of nucleosynthesis. If it had been appreciably slower, then the force of gravity would have overcome the expansion and everything would recollapse, right? And so all that's physics, and I'm sure a lot of the audience doesn't really want to delve into that, but just the basic idea is that the science seems to indicate the universe as a whole is balanced on the edge of a knife. Fine-tuned is the metaphor. I think it's increasingly dated because nobody actually tunes anything anymore, but of an old style radio dial where you had to turn the knob and get it just right, otherwise you had static, right? So that's the message of cosmic fine-tuning, that physics seems to be exquisitely adjusted so that life is even possible in the universe.
So do you think it would be correct to sort of characterize the claim that the universe is fine-tuned for some property to say that, well, for all we know, the ways that the universe could have been, right, the set of them that have this property is like a very, very small set, and that means that it's finely tuned for that property?
That's right. Correct. So there are certainly some background assumptions for this claim that the universe is fine-tuned. For one thing, there's the assumption that these numbers could have been different, and some have claimed, and not on really physical grounds, but more on philosophical grounds, that they couldn't have been different. That in fact, for some reason, it's necessary that the values of the parameters are what they are. And in that case, there really aren't all these other options, and so there is no such thing as fine-tuning. That's something you can say. Another thing that I think is, worth exploring, I'm telling you what fine-tuning is, not everybody agrees with it, is that you might think there are actually a lot of other ways that these parameters could be arranged so that you get structure in a universe. It wouldn't necessarily be just like ours, but it would allow for the possibility of complex structures and something like a Darwinian process to unfold. But if you look at the nearby universes, so to speak, the ones that are relatively, quite similar to ours, except for differing just by, let's say, the value of the nuclear strong force, it doesn't look like a high percentage of them are life permitting. In fact, it looks like a vanishingly small percentage of those are life permitting.
So I guess one question when we're talking about the universe being finely tuned for life is what it means to have a universe that has life, right? So part of my question is how are people kind of defining life or using that word life, and does our characterization of life matter for how we, assess whether or not the universe is?
Absolutely. That's a perfectly relevant question, right? It would be not anthropocentric, a kind of centrism, pterocentric for Earth-centric, perhaps, maybe DNA-centric, but to think that because our life has a certain structure, that's the only kind of structure that life could have. However, I think, even if you've got a pretty good imagination, it's pretty hard to see how anything that would deserve the label life could arise in the universe that lasted a tenth of a second, for example, or a universe where the average density of matter was 1 hydrogen atom every cubic parsec or something like that, right? And that's the kind of dead or dormant universe you're talking about for the most part as the alternatives, right? So the defenders of the fine-tuning argument will say, yeah, we can quibble about exactly what it would take to count as a life-permitting universe, and maybe there are other, I'm sure there are other ways, but we're talking about the impossibility of any sort of complex structure. And it's pretty hard to think of a universe with life that has no complex structure, assuming you're philosophically a materialist, right? Obviously, if you believe in spirits, I guess they could exist in any universe, maybe, I don't know. But if they're going to be material beings, there do seem to be some prerequisites.
Right, yeah, because that was the sort of a question I was going to raise is what you think about this sort of question of the possibility of different psychophysical laws, so it seems like almost the conception of life that's being used is a highly sort of naturalized one, right? So when the claim is put forward that the universe is fine-tuned for life, that maybe this sort of embeds some further claim, right, about what life is, that life is in some sense grounded, or I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, in physical structures of some sort, because I've seen people like Luke Barnes say, well, it's difficult. Okay, I can't give you I can't give you an exact characterization of what life is, but I can tell you what it's not. Like in this world, for example, you can't get. But that still seems to be sort of parasitic on this idea of physical structures that life is, in some sense grounded in. And I wondered whether, in your view, the universe being fine-tuned for life is sort of looking at a possibility space that kind of keeps fixed all of the psychophysical laws. So it's sort of not including
Well,
like solely.
okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I know this has got quite a.
That just it's. I think I can deal with this fairly quickly, right? So in philosophy, there are all sorts of non-physicalistic, non-materialistic worldviews, right? There is idealism in the sense of George Berkeley, where there's God and then minds that have ideas, and sort of like the Matrix, right? Or Inception, God just directly controls thoughts in your minds, and you don't need any physical substrate for that at all, right? But in the context of cosmic fine-tuning for life, which is usually used as an argument for the existence of God, right? If you're talking with an idealist, a Berkeleyan idealist, right? You don't need to give them this scientific argument for the existence of God, because belief in the existence of God is already built into the philosophical theory, right? So the idea of fine-tuning for life as the basis for an argument for something that's non-physical, right? God. I just feel like the possibility of other psychophysical laws is not, I guess, not really relevant. If it's being used to try to convince the materialist to switch, okay, then of course you need to be working with a materialist set of or materialist conception of what it is to be a mind. Does that make sense?
No, that does make sense. I agree that that's an important point, because there's a sense in which it could be, kind of question begging, right? If the premises are not going to be ones that the physicalist themselves agrees to.
Right.
I think why I find this question interesting is because I sort of think if embedded in that claim that fine-tuning is evidence that people have to update on or explain or something like that, if embedded in that claim is this sort of commitment to excluding disembodied minds, right? Then
Right.
an explanation that includes a disembodied mind might be kind of
correct.
ruled out. Yeah, that's.
And this is something that I talk about in some of my papers, right? And we haven't gotten, if you're listening for the audience, we haven't gotten yet to this idea of a Bayesian argument, a probability-based argument where you're updating your probabilities based on this new evidence. But for a certain kind of really committed materialist, right? The prior probability, the starting probability of God's existing is zero, because for some of them, they're going to say the idea is incoherent. It's like talking about a round square, talking about an immaterial mind. It just doesn't make any sense. So it has no chance to go anywhere, right? But the proponents of the fine-tuning argument aren't really talking to those people. I mean, you're not going to make a lot of progress with them, right? Yeah, this stuff needs to be sorted out, and a lot of times it's not in the discussion of the fine-tuning argument, the existence of God, but kind of behind the scenes is the assumption that the atheists at least regard theism, or if not theism, right, the existence of some supernatural intelligence as a hypothesis with a non-zero probability. It has a chance, however small, right? Otherwise, you're not really going to make a lot of progress convincing anybody with this fine-tuning argument. But hopefully, I don't know where your questions were heading, but down the line, I hope to talk about the theological presuppositions of fine-tuning argument and how the two different sides look at those. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some questions that should get to that in a second. So, as you were just kind of touching on, then maybe we could introduce. So, what are some different forms of the fine-tuning argument that are out there, and what do you see as being kind of like the best form of the argument for discussing?
Well, if by form, do you mean logical form? Like, what's the logical structure of the argument?
Yeah, so say, like I think William Lane Craig gives a sort of deductive argument, where he's like, well, either chance, necessity, or design, and not, or probabilistic, or inference to the best explanation.
Right. So, yeah, and again, I don't want to. This gets into fairly narrow stuff about logic and probability theory, but some people regard the fine-tuning argument, or they propose the fine-tuning argument as a full-blown Bayesian inference, which means that you have to start off making assertions that your audience can at least understand, perhaps accept, about what the prior probability is, what the probability is prior to hearing about this evidence of fine-tuning, that a supernatural being exists or that God exists, and then a probability of that being's existing conditional on this new evidence, and then that's going to yield a new probability. Some people say, frame the argument saying, well, we're all we're looking at is how it would adjust your probabilities, not what your final probability would be. So we're just the grounds of conflict are whether the fine-tuning evidence should or shouldn't raise your probability that God exists. Other people think it takes a quite different form of inference. You mentioned William Lane Craig, and I believe he's drawing from, I'm killing myself here, William Dembski and his explanatory filter idea, where you actually have a deductive argument. There are only three possibilities: design, chance, or
necessity, I think.
Necessity. And you rule out the other two, and you're left with design. It's not a matter of probably it's designed, it must be designed, right? I look at the argument because I think it's the version that lays its cards on the table entirely as a full-blown Bayesian inference. I think that's the way to discuss the argument. Then you have to talk about your prior probability that, let's just say God, your prior probability that God exists. You have to come out and say what the probability is that if God existed, there would be a life-permitting universe, and so on. You have to spell it all out. So I think the best way to look at these arguments is in terms of being a Bayesian inference, B-A-Y-E-S, and that's a whole other can of worms. What Bayesian inferences are, but that's another episode.
Just one more question briefly then on Bayesian inference, and hopefully it's possible to answer this without getting too much into the weeds. But I mean, do you think that the fine-tuning proponent should be putting the argument forward as an inference saying this is what your posterior in theism should be in light of this evidence or something? Or do you think that it's best kind of framed as the odds, between two posteriors? So maybe like theism compared to its negation, atheism.
Well, we'll get to this. We'll get to this. Maybe I'll bring this up right now. There are some people who think it doesn't really matter that much what the posteriors were, because the increase in the probability of theism is just so dramatic with fine tuning that even if your initial odds of God's existing were 1 in a million, it's going to make virtually no difference to the power of the argument. I've got a paper about people who made that claim, right? And I respond that I don't think you can do it that easily, and in fact, you really do have to come out and say what these priors are and what the conditional probabilities are, and what your justification is for those priors and what your justification is for those conditional probabilities. So, for example, I just don't think it is very clear that if God exists, it is more likely than not that God would create a universe with life. I think the person who says we can't know at all, it's truly inscrutable what God would do if God existed, and so we can assign no conditional probability at all to there existing a life-permitting universe if God exists. I think that's that really needs to be discussed.
So prior to the evidence then, how do we get our prior for theism? So when we're talking about the prior probability here, is this in some sense a pure prior to all evidence whatsoever? I mean,
that's a great question too, and I don't know how to answer that. I mean, you've got people like Richard Swinburne saying that theism posits the simplest possible concrete being. God is, this goes back to Thomistic, St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomistic theology. God is, all God's attributes are really the same attribute. There is no internal division in God. God is the simplest possible being that's conceivable. And so the antecedent probability that God exists is 1/2, right? Half is there's nothing, half is there's something like that, right? So you could, and if I'm misrepresenting Swinburne's argument, it's something along those lines. Or you could say the prior probability of theism is very high. Other people assign it something lower, but they give it a fighting chance. And then there's that group of people who say, as I mentioned before, well, we really don't need to have a very specific prior probability for theism. Just as long as you grant it's greater than 1 in a billion, right? And the alternative is that if God doesn't exist, the chance that the universe is just right for life is 1 out of 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, or some ridiculous number like that, then it won't matter if your initial probability of God's existence was 1 in a billion. That gets swamped by the incomprehensible improbability of the universes being life permitting. Is that, yeah? But how do you get a prior probability for theism? That's just a gigantic question about, theology in general, and I don't.
Yeah. So, my thinking here might be there are different ways of thinking about priors, right? And one of them might be that we want to talk about a prior, before we have any evidence, but it's unclear if that's even a kind of coherent idea. Yeah. And then the other idea is if we're talking about then our prior before we get, the fine-tuning evidence. Now, as you say, for skeptics, that's, regardless of what that is, the theist claims that's going to be kind of overwhelmed by the other evidence. But for theists, right, they're just going to have a prior that already assigns, God's existing, right? So the evidence, even if it might improve, well, if it's 1, it's going to, but yeah. Oh, you've gone really quiet, by the way. I'm not sure. I can't quite hear. Yeah, I can't quite. I'm not sure if you've disconnected your microphone or something. Maybe if you click the settings at the bottom, and just check in the audio tab that. your micro. Yeah, there we go. I heard that. Oh no, still very quiet. I heard like as though you were clicking or setting something down. I don't know if you've. No. Yeah, no, sorry. No, it sounds very sort of muffled. Let me see what people are saying. Yeah, people in the chat.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, is that sellotape or something?
I had a sellotape over it. Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't
okay.
know that's where the microphone is. Very strange. You can hear me now?
Yeah, I got you now.
Okay, I hope you can edit all that out. Sorry about all that.
It's all right.
What was the question again?
So the question was, sorry, I'm just going.
No, sorry. Yeah, we were talking about the prior probability of theism, and he said, well, of course, theists are going to have a high prior probability for theism, and this is kind of an academic point, but not entirely, right? There are plenty of theists who there are theists, at least philosophically, who would say, I believe in God, but I don't assign a high prior probability to the existence of God, right? You could have Kierkegaard or some existentialist Christian say, this belief of mine is absurd and is contrary to all the evidence I have. So if I take all the evidence besides this fine-tuning stuff, I don't think it points to the existence of God, but I'm going to believe anyway, right? That's a coherent possibility, it seems to me. So I wouldn't just assume that theists, just by being theists, have a high prior probability for the existence of God. I agree that most of them do, but
okay. Just because I'm getting a bit of feedback, by the way, when I'm asking questions, I've just popped you on mute for a second, and then I'll unmute after, so it doesn't feedback for the audience and they hear twice.
You just muted me.
Yeah, and you can unmute yourself.
Let me go back to settings and sound again, and I'm sorry for the people there. I've got echo cancellation, stereo audio, and automatically adjust mic volume.
I'm not sure it'll make a difference. I think it's because it's coming out the speakers, so it's being picked up again by that. Oh, actually, I can't hear myself now, so maybe that's a bit better. We'll see. Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I'm not getting the echo now, so as long as you can hear me, that's all right. So then we've got our priors in place. So what is the proposed theistic explanation then for why is it that theism makes more sense of this?
Well, that's a great question, right? So if you mean by explanation, if you mean a how does God make there exist something out of nothing? There's not going to be an answer to that. It's God is beyond us, and there's no how to creation ex nihilo. But if by an explanation you mean a why, it's going to tie into some beliefs about the nature of God, namely that God is morally perfect, so that God is a good being. And here I've attacked this line of thinking in some of my articles, but because I think people are just not saying a lot here. Because God good, it is to be expected that God would create other things that are good, and intelligent conscious life is good. And so it's not unexpected. It's to be expected that God would create a universe that has the possibility of life in it, right? When I say that that's not really well defended, I've got an article called The Why Design Question, where I show how a lot of people just fumble through this. A lot of people who write on the fine-tuning argument are not philosophers, right? And so they aren't very careful, and they say, well, you just look at the Bible, right? And look at Genesis. That's why God created. Wait a minute. You're supposed to be giving an argument that's what's called natural theology. It's not supposed to presuppose the truth of any of this revealed stuff. So you can't use that to justify your claim that God is likely to create a world with life. So somehow you have to make an inference just from the nature of moral perfection that would go from that to the likelihood of creating. I haven't seen many people in the literature do this. The one person that comes to mind is Richard Swinburne in his book, The Existence of God, and also in his chapter in my anthology where he says, well, being morally perfect, God would want there to be as much good as there possibly could be. And the great, one of the greatest goods is entering into free relationships with other beings. So it would be expected that God would create such beings, but those beings would need an arena in which to develop morally and socially, and so they need to be embodied. You know, it's a very complex argument, but he gives an argument for why God would be expected to do such a thing. There are skeptics on the other side who say we have absolutely no idea what God would do. There's a philosopher in my anthology, Jan Narveson, who said, I like the phrase, bodiless-minded super creators are a category that's way out of control, right? They could do anything. So we can't really have any prior expectations on what they'd actually do. So I don't know which ones of those, which of those is the right approach, but yeah, the theist is going to say the expectation that God would create a life-permitting universe is grounded in God's moral perfection.
And how much of that kind of how high is that likelihood conditional on theism according to theistic proponents of the fine-tuning argument?
Yeah, that's another tough question, right? Because you might think, well, God could achieve that without creating anything material at all. God could make Berkeley right, okay, so that all there are immaterial minds. So I would say ask one of them, right? How much it makes it. But again, the fallback position for many of them is we don't really have to nail down very well this probability that God would create a life-permitting universe if God existed, because whatever that number is, it's going to be way higher than the probability that the universe is fine-tuned for life if there isn't a God.
So I mean, yeah, maybe we can kind of drill into that response a little bit in a second. I mean,
can I just add here? For years I've been saying to the people who are part of this literature on the fine-tuning argument, this is the number one thing you need to do. Spell it out why you think God would create a universe with life. Do it in a way that doesn't, presuppose the truth of Scripture. Give it for the regular audience. And I haven't had a lot of takers on that.
In terms of Swinburne's sort of argument, what would he say to this idea that, intrinsic to God's nature, as it were, God's kind of self-sufficient and having desires implies a lack or something like that. So almost even assigning any desires to God is a sort of strange thing to do.
That's how I tend to look at it, right? I think, and I talk about this in my article, The Design Argument and Natural Theology. And if people want to look up my departmental webpage, I think I've got links to all these things. But in the Design Argument and Natural Theology, I say if you're actually working with traditional perfect being theology of the sort you get from Aquinas, there doesn't seem to be any motivation for God to create, because they have to say that a world with just God in it, a world prior to God's creation, is absolutely perfect, right? Because God is self-sufficient. So you can't say that by creating, God makes the world as a whole better, in a sense, right? God is already the maximal being. And there's some maneuvers you can make. You can say, well, God is the greatest possible being with respect to certain sets of values, but there are other values that can't be instantiated by a single being alone. Like, let's say you think relationships are intrinsically valuable, relational values, right? Now, of course, you might think God has some intrinsic relatedness because God's three persons in one, but set that aside, right? You might think God needs there to be other beings for these relational values to come into existence. And so that's why God needs to create, right? But I agree with you. It's a tough question for the theist.
So I have a question now about comparing hypotheses. So sometimes what I see is being done when this kind of comparison of how theism fares, conditional and fine tuning, it's usually compared to how not theism does. But not theism is a sort of catch-all hypothesis, which is to
Right.
say it includes a bunch
Correct.
of other hypotheses. I mean, do you think that that particular type of comparison is fair? And if so, what why not? And what?
I think it's perfectly fair to say, um, if I had to choose theism versus the field, I don't know if you use that language. The field is all the other alternatives, right?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Right.
Uh,
Yes.
uh, Theism versus the field, I'll take the field, but I wouldn't take, I take the field again. I don't know. I'm making this up because I don't know British football. I
Right.
take the field over Arsenal to win whatever cup, right? But I take Arsenal over any particular team, right? And any particular
I
matchup,
see.
I'd say Arsenal is more. It's more likely that Arsenal wins than that team. And that's what you're asking here, right? It's theism versus the field versus
Yeah.
theism versus the multiverse hypothesis, or
Yeah.
theism versus necessity, or theism versus something that involves a supernatural designer, but not
Not a
theism.
god. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Um, I think it's, I mean, is it fair? I mean, I just said there are
Yeah.
two different ways of looking at it. There are two different ways of looking at it, right? Is it fair to say I take the field over Arsenal? Yeah, that's fair. Is it fair to say I take Arsenal over anyone, particularly in the field? Yeah, that's also fair. End of question, I guess, right?
Yeah. So maybe how how I'd phrase this question differently would be, for people who are kind of concerned with figuring out, well, what the best hypothesis is, I mean, should they be doing that, or should it be this comparison to like specific alternatives?
Well, yeah, I guess that depends on a person's motives, right? If a person says, "Look, for what's of practical importance to me, um, how I live my life is not going to be affected very much, uh, depending on whether this is the only universe and there's no God at all, or whether there's a multiverse with countless universes, and so one that's just by chance right for life." So I don't really care about all the non-theistic alternatives, and if Odin created the universe but doesn't have an afterlife where I get punished, I don't really care about that either. But wait a minute, if it's God, that's the one I got to care about, because now there are different consequences to my actions and that sort of thing, right? So, um, uh, I think it's fair for a person to be particularly interested in the theism versus all the alternatives way of framing it, and find it less urgent to know which of those particular alternatives is the one. Now, I mean, you might think, hey, it renders my life meaningless if there is an infinite multiverse and there are infinite duplicates of me out there, and everything that's I do has been done before. People have thought that way. Nietzsche thought that way, right? But for the most part, I don't see that people are losing sleep over which of the non-theistic hypotheses is the correct one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I understand what you're saying. So maybe to try to repeat back to what you said, and you can tell me if this is accurate. You said, well, it sort of depends on your goals, values, and desires, right? And it might seem that this question of whether or not a god exists is sort of more pressing because
Right.
it has stuff to do with eternal consequences and
Right.
Stuff like that. So my next question then is comparing theism to specific non-theistic hypotheses. So, for example, a multiverse. I mean, how does it fare if we do this? And maybe if you could introduce what a multiverse.
Yeah. So great. I'm glad we got around to the multiverse hypothesis, because that's where a lot of the interesting philosophical action is as well. So I always illustrate this for modern audiences with the example of parkour videos, but I'm not sure everybody knows what those are.
Parkour, like running around.
Does everybody use that language internationally? PARKOUR?
like running around doing
Yeah,
flips
right,
off
right.
stuff.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
so skateboarding or free, it's also called free running. And,
Right.
you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
you see some really incredible things that people do, right? You see them on YouTube or TikTok or what have you. Um, what should you think when you see one of those videos? Well, I've been around and I know people have video recorders. I don't think they got it right the first time. So I'm not super surprised when I see somebody make, I like basketball, somebody make a basketball shot from, 100 meters away, right? If you give them enough trials, they're going to get it right eventually, right? Same thing with parkour or free running. So that's an illustration of the fact that surprising phenomena can be explained. You can get your surprise greatly reduced when you have as a background that there are, in fact, a lot of trials, and there's variation in those trials, right? So that um, the odds go up dramatically that one of them will be a success. But then also you need a selection mechanism that leads you to be viewing the success. And of course, that's pretty clear in the case of parkour as well. Most people don't want to see failures, although there are fail videos as well, and those can be funny. Most people want to see the successes. So just by being a failure, the tape is not going to be saved, and that's it. I just did. I'm on TikTok. I just did some proofs on TikTok. I tried it 4 times before I got it right. What happened to the other 3? They got discarded. Okay, so you're only going to see the successes. All right. Well, now apply that to this fine tuning idea. If there are many universes besides this one, and the values of the free parameters are actually determined randomly by, however, some mechanism as yet to be described, then you would expect that there would be all sorts of universes, all varieties of universes, and most of them would be failures or duds, just like most attempts to complete a stunt fail. But if you try it enough times, you're going to get one where things go right. And in the case of life, like ourselves, that's the only kind of universe we could ever observe. This is a principle called the anthropic principle. If you may have heard that before, the idea that the universe must have whatever conditions are necessary for us to be observing it. Interpreted as an epistemological principle, that's right? We're not going to observe conditions that are incompatible with engaging in observation. We're not going to find ourselves in the center of the sun or in the deepest part of intergalactic space, right? We're going to find ourselves where life is possible. So it changes the question, not why is if I ask why is the planet Earth just right for life, I think that's kind of a dumb question, because wherever life is, the conditions are going to be hospitable for life. The right question is, why is life possible anywhere? I've got a really good explanation for, well, I've got the start of an explanation for that, which is that there are a lot of chances. If you look at modern astronomy, and you feel like everybody knows now about the discovery of planets outside of our solar system. It's just an amazing result of the last 25 years of astronomy, right? You've got a galaxy with whatever 100 billion stars. Almost every star system has planets around it. There are going to be a lot of chances for there to be a star that has just the right kind of characteristics, a planet that's just the right distance from that star, and so on. Okay, so it's not surprising that there exists a planet where conditions are right for life. And to me, that's the end of the story, right? Then you don't need the question, but why is it here? Is a dumb question. We wouldn't be talking about here if it weren't the place where life arose. So apply that to the universe. The multiverse idea says that likewise, there are all these other universes, and odds are one of them is going to be just right for life. Of course, that's the only kind we're going to see. So that's why we observe the universe to be fine-tuned for life. The objection that comes right away to that is, well, wait a minute. we can observe other stars and other galaxies, but there's no observational evidence of other universes. So the hypothesis looks like it's just been pulled out of thin air. And we could talk about that. I've done a survey of cosmologists about this, and a lot of them say that the idea of a multiverse is actually independently motivated, and in fact that there are or could be observational tests of whether there are other universes. That's a question for the physicists. So I would just caution people who declare this quotation I gave years ago has made the rounds. The multiverse is the last resort of the desperate atheist. I was trying to report how it's viewed by critics of the multiverse hypothesis. I would not be too quick to say that. All right, you really should be checking with the subject matter experts, the physicists, and the indications I have from them are that it's a coherent hypothesis. A lot of them think it falls out of other aspects of their theory, like quantum mechanics. So you just have to ask them. I can't really say whether the multiverse hypothesis is independently motivated or has evidence for it beyond the ability to explain the apparent fine-tuning of the universe.
You really should have consulted your intuitions rather than conducting a survey. But are the results of the survey...
That's exactly what I don't want to do. Did you read my survey?
Well, I was going to ask, is it published somewhere? Because I've not...
Yeah, it's published. It's called the multiverse. The multiverse: What Philosophers and Theologians Get Wrong.
Right. Yeah, I saw that title actually.
And I got 126 relevant scientists, physicists, cosmologists, some string theorists, to answer a survey I composed about the multiverse hypothesis. And yeah, it was some interesting results. Like they do not seem to think that the multiverse hypothesis is primarily motivated by a desire to avoid theism. Right, that's a very common allegation, but of the people who responded to that question, only one said that that's the sole reason that the multiverse hypothesis is popular. Some people think it has something to do with it. Some people think it maybe has a lot to do with it. A lot of people think it has nothing to do with it. So really, to me, it's a kind of a slur against the physicists. If you're saying that they're abusing science to avoid a religious conclusion, it's a pretty strong allegation. So I wanted to check by asking them.
So one sort of objection that's been raised recently in sort of apologetic circles as well to the multiverse hypothesis is to claim that multiverse hypotheses, all of them, commit the inverse gambler's fallacy. So this
I just published something about this. I don't know if you saw that.
I did. Yeah. So I was gonna. So just to state quickly what the inverse gambler's fallacy is, it's the idea that if you're asking the question, well, why is this universe fine-tuned, for example? Well, then if you've got some kind of random, random setting of the various free parameters mechanism, well, the sort of chances of any individual setting of the parameters in a universe being what they are, it's independent of the previous settings, as it were. So this setting being the values that they are the probability isn't increased by there being like previous random settings. So now is that an accurate characterization of what the multiverse hypothesis is saying according to you, though? And so does the inverse gambler's fallacy sort of bite again? Yeah.
Let me give an example for the audience for what this inverse gambler's fallacy is supposed to be. Right. I don't know if everybody plays poker, but I sit down and I play a hand of poker with you for a lot of money, and and I'm dealing the cards. And on the first hand, you get an incredibly powerful hand. You get 4 of a kind, but I deal myself a royal flush, and I win thousands of pounds from you, right? And you're very suspicious of this, but I say, well. If you look at the history of human card playing, millions and millions of poker hands have been dealt, and in that context, it's really not at all surprising that a four of a kind has been beaten by a royal flush. And in fact, I play poker, and I've seen some things that blow your mind, right? One four of a kind losing to another four of a kind. It happens, okay? But the objection is, yes, there have been all those other trials, but none of them explain why this trial, right, is one where you got a royal flush and I got four of a kind, right? It's still suspicious because what happened in all those other trials doesn't affect the probability of this one, right? If before the cards were dealt, you were trying to figure out what are the odds that I get four of a kind and the other person gets a royal flush, you would be making a mistake if you said, well, tell me how many hands of poker have been played before this. It's just totally irrelevant. And that's the same point being made about the multiverse. The claim is that even if there are these other universes, they don't do anything to account for why this one is fine-tuned for life. And there's a lot of back and forth on this. I've tried to, in my paper, I tried to boil it down because there really are a lot of intricacies to it. But basically, the people who are defenders in the multiverse think that it's just a bad question to ask why it's this one that's fine-tuned for life, because there isn't any way to pick out this universe except as the universe that is fine-tuned for life. It's not like we've got that card game, right? I'm in it. It matters to me. That's the relevant card game for me, okay? But it's not like I've got, from a God's eye point of view, I'm looking out at all the possible universes and saying, hey, there's that one universe, and things need to go right in that one for me to exist, okay?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be the situation metaphysically. An example I give, there was an earthquake in Armenia, I think about 35 years ago, and a lot of people died, okay, flattened whole villages. And there was a story about a family that survived in the ruins. And my friend called attention to this story, and she said it was a miracle. I said, well, tens of thousands of people died. That's a lot of chances for somebody to survive. And she said, well, but it's a miracle that they survived. And I said, well, wait a minute, that's not right, because you don't know anything about them except that they're the survivors, right? It's not like Elvis Presley survived. It's the survivors survived. When you say they survived, you're saying the survivors survived. There's nothing special about them from my perspective, except that they're the ones who survived. And she called me a big jerk who ruins things, right? But her words were stronger than that. But I think that's right? There's nothing notable about the universe, this universe, besides the fact that it's the one that has life in it. Now, you might think, well, but I couldn't have existed in one of those other universes. The only way I could have existed is if this universe turns out to be just right for life. I'm not so sure about that. I think I could have existed if I had been born in a different hometown than I actually was born in, right? I think I could have existed if I was born an hour earlier than I actually was. So I'm not, what exactly are the limits on where I could and couldn't have existed, and how tied am I to this universe? I don't know. These are all metaphysical questions, right, for metaphysicians to explore. I just don't, I think this inverse gambler's fallacy allegation, and you're right, it is very, very common. William Lane Craig makes it frequently. I just don't think it has really been thought through. It's not as decisive as the objectors think it is. That's not to say that this is a point in favor of the multiverse hypothesis, right? There might be no reason in favor of the multiverse hypothesis at all, but it's an attempt to say that the multiverse hypothesis, even if it were true, wouldn't do the job. And I don't think that that's been established.
So I've had some questions from the audience throughout, but I want to just check because we are coming up at 1 minute past the hour.
I'm happy to go on. I'm happy to keep talking if you are.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah, if people have more questions, get them in. But otherwise, I've got the ones that have been asked so far. So there was a question. I mean, this is fairly vague. What about non-anthropic fine-tuning? I don't know if there's enough in that for you to be able to.
I don't know what that person means by non-anthropic fine-tuning. So I don't.
Yeah.
I had an example. I could, if they want to take another stab at it and provide a little more detail, I can. Why don't we come back to that one, see if they can give a little more, flesh that out a little more.
No problem. B.S. Lewis asks, how does fine-tuning escape the God of the Gaps accusation of a God that can do anything? I'm not sure about the last bit on that of a God that can do anything, but in terms of the God of the Gaps stuff, maybe.
Okay, I'm going to reformulate this. I think what makes sense. So the God of the Gaps allegation is that there's a pattern in the history of science when humans encounter a phenomenon they can't explain, instead of saying, hold on, let's let science play its course and in the future an explanation will be developed, people say, well, God did it, especially if it's somehow favorable to us, right? So I'm trying, there are countless, God of the Gaps, trying to think of a specific example here where people thought that God did something and it turns out, here's a God of the Gaps.
The separation of the races or something.
Isaac Newton thought that by his own calculations, right, the planets should have collapsed, or the orbit should have collapsed by now, but they didn't. And so his explanation was that God was constantly imparting force to keep them in their orbits. So God was doing the job. And subsequent science showed that there was an alternative explanation that didn't bring God into the picture, right? So the allegation here is, well, we've got this phenomenon of fine-tuning. We don't have an explanation right now. And at Digital, or B.S. Lewis is saying, I take it they're saying we should be taking the same attitude now, right? I tend strongly to agree with that, right? I'll give a different example, but it's also related to design arguments. I've always thought that intelligent design theorists or so-called creationists, who say, well, there is no origin of life scenario that's fleshed out according to science, right? We don't have any a scientific account of abiogenesis right now. How did non-life come to form the first life? There just isn't any explanation. And they reached the conclusion that instead God did it. And again, that might be right. But my first thought on that is, wow, we only discovered the DNA molecule in 1947, so it's 75 years ago. I mean, these scientific fields are still, from a historical perspective, are in their infancies. We really don't have, we haven't really spent a lot of time trying to figure out this problem. Just hold off, right? Just hold off on saying science can't explain how life arose. Give it some time. And I sense that B.S. Lewis is suggesting the same thing about fine-tuning, that let's let the scientists think about it a little bit more, right? And that's a reasonable viewpoint. I do think, the multiverse hypothesis, it relies on theoretical physics, which is in flux, and it's very muddy out there. The picture is very murky. So maybe things will be cleared up where we have a better sense of how fine-tuning could have arisen without a God. Right? Give it time. It's just a practical point, right? Be very, very reluctant, or I should say, it's an inductive argument, right? Time after time, these theistic explanations of natural phenomena have been upended with the provision of a naturalistic explanation. So don't make that mistake again. Otherwise, theism is constantly in retreat. It's actually a point a theist can make. Like, let's not play this game.
So Matthew asks, if souls can exist without the material world, in what sense is anything fine-tuned for life? Can Neil comment on these ideas?
Yeah, people have, so people have, this gets in some interesting stuff, right? I don't know if you heard this idea of Boltzmann brains, right? So that even if the physics were significantly different, still by, I guess, random quantum fluctuations in an infinite universe, you would expect that just by chance there would be a brain, I guess, floating around in space that would have the exact same mental contents as my brain. And so there would exist a conscious being that had all of my experiences, but there wouldn't be around it the material world that it thought was around it, right? That's kind of a skeptical hypothesis, although in that one, there's still a material base for the brain. But let's say you don't think you need a physical brain at all. Let's say you think thinking happens in this non-material thing. Well, yeah, in that sense, you wouldn't need a universe that's fine-tuned at all. I mean, you could conceivably, God could set up some psychophysical laws so that there is conscious life in a universe that has a molecule every, cubic light year, right? So, yeah, I would say there's no you don't need fine tuning unless you have a presupposition that life and intelligence has to be embodied somehow.
Melchior asks, what is the best theistic solution to the fine-tuning of the universe that escapes the fine-tuning of divine psychology or definition of good?
Okay, so the fine-tuning of divine psychology.
So I think the idea here is something like, I can imagine lots of different ways that God's psychology might be. So yeah, it seems that God's very fine.
Right. So if I let me tell you, I'll tell you what I think the person's saying, and you tell me if you think that's accurately representing what they're saying, right? I've got an arrangement of books on my desk, and they seem random to me, but it's possible that there exists a book organizing gnome that enters into rooms when people aren't there and arranges books in precisely the order in which I see them arranged. Well, that hypothesis does a great job of explaining this observation I have, right? But the problem with it is that its antecedent probability is incredibly low, right? What are the odds that a gnome would have exactly that set or array of wants and desires to match up exactly with what I observed? And I take it that this person is raising that same question, right? Whatever we gain in whatever explaining we do through this theistic hypothesis, all that advantage drains away from having to have built into the theistic hypothesis exactly the wants and desires that are needed to lead to this result, to this universe. Is that what you think the person's asking?
I think that is what the person's asking, but the way that I took it is maybe getting at it slightly. So it's saying, I think that they're saying, suppose that I sort of buy the whole thing, I'm still left with this kind of further fine-tuning question. And I think that this is going to turn out to be equivalent to saying that there's like a really low, prior probability of God having this psychology. But maybe they would say, maybe it would be then a question.
I wouldn't even say, I wouldn't say, so I've got a paper called How Not to Be Generous to Fine-Tuning Skeptics. And I would advise this person take a look at that one, because this issue comes up, right? You're trying to make a judgment about what a designer, a perfect being would do. And maybe the answer is it's just inscrutable, right? I just can't know what a being with unlimited power, knowledge, and so forth would be likely to do, okay? Certainly it's consistent with what we observe, that God created it. Well, I shouldn't say certainly it's consistent. Some people think it's not consistent, right? Because of the problem of evil, right? There's no way God would have created a universe with all this horrible stuff in it. I'll set that aside, right? Let's just assume, yeah, it's consistent. God could have created a universe that has intelligent life in it. But why think antecedently that scenario is more likely than any other? Right? There are just so many options. And I'm raising these questions. I've puzzled over all these questions for years, but I don't really know. I don't have a good answer to that question.
So the first question has been reformulated as well. What about I think Lee Smolins' idea?
Lee Smolins' idea that that's a particular version of the multiverse hypothesis, where there's kind of an evolution of universes, right? Universes that if you've got a black hole, Smolin sketches out a mechanism whereby they create new universes, and the properties of the created universes are partially heritable, so that if a universe has black holes in it, that increases the probability that the universe that comes out of it also has black holes in it, so that universes that are such as to contain black holes come to predominate the population of universes as a whole. But universes that contain black holes just are going to be the universes that have gravity and laws of physics like ours, and so are just right for life. So there's your explanation for cosmic fine-tuning for life. Fascinating idea. Hey, I'm merely a philosopher, so I don't know what to say about something like this. But yeah, it's a fascinating idea.
So another question then is Robin Collins / Luke Barnes say that the multiverse itself requires fine-tuning. Are they right?
Yeah, I think certainly it's absolutely fair to say, what's this mechanism out there that's generating this multitude of universes, and why does it have the characteristics that it has? And if those characteristics are just as fine-tuned as the universe itself, you haven't really made an advance in terms of solving this problem by saying that there's a multiverse. Yeah, so I know that allegation. I don't. Again, so listen. I have a philosophy degree. Collins, I think, has a PhD in physics, or at least an advanced degree in physics. Barnes is a theoretical physicist, so I defer to them, right? I can't dispute that claim. I'm not a proponent of the multiverse hypothesis. I can say, just if it's true, if we assume it, what does and doesn't follow from it? That's the kind of question that I look at.
So does the moral aspect of our universe make a difference as to why this universe exists? I guess that's a question maybe about from a divine psychology perspective, but
if you mean, is this the only universe that could have value? I don't know, but I'm going to go a slightly different direction with this question. I'm not sure it's what the questioner intended. I've talked with a lot of young theistic philosophers over the last decade, and a surprising position is emerging. They actually think that God is likely to create a multiverse. So you kind of get to have the best of both worlds, right? You get to say, there's God in the picture. The whole thing was created, and there's a multiverse. And one thing I've always wondered about that, from the perspective of Christians, it's a long discussion, in the history of Christian theology. How important is it for the incarnation to be a unique event, right? So, is it okay if there are other planets with intelligent life on them, and are they excluded from salvation because the incarnation didn't happen there? Or does an incarnation happen on that planet? And if an incarnation can happen on another planet, why couldn't it happen in another galaxy or even in another universe, right? I don't know how to answer. Again, these are theological questions I don't know the answer to, but you might think that right? It's only in this reality or in this universe where there was an incarnation, I guess. So the other universes wouldn't count in terms of having a moral value. Again, I'm just speculating here. I don't know what to say in response to that. That's an internal problem for theists, and in particular for, seems to me, Christian theists.
I think Robin Collins has says something like in the Blackwell Companion chapter that something like moral realism needs to be built into fine tuning to get
certainly. Yeah, you do. If you I talk about this in one of my papers too, right? If you believe that morality is just a social construction or is the output of our evolved nature or some such thing, right? And otherwise it's not a real feature of the universe, then the argument isn't going to get anywhere. The fine-tuning argument isn't going to get anywhere. But I think there are powerful arguments for moral realism as well. So it's not that implausible of a position, right, to presuppose moral realism.
So what do you think about the prospects of fine-tuning for the second stage of contingency?
Yeah. So the philosopher Timothy O'Connor, I've got his book on my shelf, but I don't have my glasses on. Shoot, it's right there. I've got to look.
It's right. Yeah.
It's killing me. It's right in front of me. Sorry, audience. Sorry, audience. It's where is it? Where is that darn thing? I'll find it later. But I know the subtitle is
Theism and Ultimate Explanation.
Theism and Ultimate Explanation, yeah. So he says that I'm being fast and loose here. You've got a contingency argument that explains why there's something rather than nothing. And he supports that argument, so that theism does answer that question, why is there something rather than nothing? But it doesn't answer the question of why there's this particular something rather than some other kind of something. And that's where fine-tuning comes in. That's the second stage of the contingency argument. Why is the reality, the concrete reality that exists, exactly what it is? And that's where you bring in the evidence of fine-tuning, and it points towards a God with that's morally perfect and that sort of thing. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I read the book, but that's how we call it. Yeah, it's a two-stage argument, and design comes after this contingency argument. I don't know if the contingency argument is basically what's the answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing? There's only one answer, and that's in terms of the existence of a necessary being, and that being would have to be God.
You have also been invited to Poker Nights, Pine Creek Poker Nights. If you're interested, I can send you the email.
Yeah, I was just complaining about people who mark their cards with their fingernails at the casino. You know, I really bugs me. So be careful what you ask for, Pine Creek. That's all I'm going to tell you.
This is online, but yeah, I think it's my suspicion, because they're at a US time, so it's about 2 or 3 a.m. for me, and yeah, my suspicion is that unsuspecting people come in and get robbed by Pine Creek, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, no, it should be 8 there, right? You're in the UK, right?
Yeah, 8:30 p.m. now. Yeah. Or just coming up to 8:30. So as well, just as a last question, then Bob Smith was interested from your atheistic perspective, if you could define or explain morality as you see it from a philosophical point.
Okay. First of all, from my atheistic perspective, he may be right, but I don't. I think I point out a lot of problems with theistic arguments, but you can't conclude from that I myself am an atheist. I'm not going to lay my cards on the table here on this international, podcast.
That's fair enough.
but having said that, you know, I don't know. I guess that's a different can of worms, right? I think what the atheist will say is whatever problems there are for atheists in defining morality, those same problems confront theists for defining morality. So theism doesn't do anything to establish the basis of morality. Right? This gets back to the old Euthyphro argument from going back to Plato. Is the good good because the gods love it, or do the gods love the good because it's good? And it seems there are good arguments for the second answer, right? That the good has to be conceived as being independently of God. Leibniz held this as well, right? When we praise God as being good for having created the world, that makes no sense if whatever God creates is by definition good, right? If God, the analogy for that one, there are artists, especially in the mid 20th century, like Jasper Johns, who are so hot, such hot prospects. I mean, such hot artists, right? They would do things like put 2 beer cans on a platform, put enamel on it, and get $1 million for it, because the view of the art marketplace seemed to be whatever they did is a work of artistic genius. Okay. Well, that doesn't seem right, though, right? That can't be what makes the artwork good art, just that an artist produced it or a famous artist produced it. It seems that there has to be some independent criterion for quality of art beyond who the creator was. And that's really the same argument you get when it comes to the nature of morality, right? It can't just be that what makes right is the fact that God commands it or God deems it to be so.
So just as a last question then to wrap up, someone wants to know what your TikTok handle is, and if you want to share any other, like where people can go to find, more
I don't know if I can even type. Can I type stuff here?
You can in the private chat, and I can.
But it's just if you want to, I'll do it in the private chat.
Yeah, and I can copy and paste it into the.
Because I've actually got some discussion of a lot of philosophical matters on my TikTok page, but I also got some logic stuff and some philosophy of science stuff and some jokes. But yeah, Big Professor Manson.
Sorry.
Thank you, whoever said great interview. I appreciate
that. Was Max, an Eastern
Max.
Orthodox Christian. Yeah. So and where else can people go as well to just find your pages?
Okay, hold on. Now I've got to pull this up.
If you're not careful, you will
I
have
think I'm on
responding to your TikTok as well.
I think. Let me see here. If you go to the webpage for the Department of Philosophy at the University of Mississippi, that will, is it right here? That will link you to my academia.edu page, which has all my publications.
Okay, I think I've got the link. Just one second.
Yeah. So let me see if I've got that right here. Hold on. I'll put that in the. Let me put that in there.
It's this one. Oh no, that's the wrong thing.
Here you go. I just sent it to you.
Yeah, great. I'll put in the thingy as well.
I would advise the audience to put Neil A. Manson, because there's another philosopher named Neil Manson. He just retired, but he's Neil C. Manson. So we do very different things.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you for coming on. I'll wrap the interview up there, and thanks for giving up so much of your time.
Well, yeah, Nathan, I'm happy to have done it. So
cool. And yeah, I'll send you the email about poker as well. Thank you, everyone.